Hi there, this is I'll Knit If I Want To, and I'm Andrea Mowry of DRK Knits, and I'm coming to you from a hotel room in Seattle. I'm getting ready to go to Bainbridge Island for the Knit Social Retreat, and I'm so excited. It's going to be so much fun. But as I shared last week, we are really smack dab in the middle of moving. So we got to Michigan, unloaded our moving truck, and I left 2 days later. So this is a little recording on the fly. Today I am wearing my Inclinations shawl. It is, as you would probably expect in Seattle, a little drizzly, a little rainy, a little cloudy. I'm gonna go out for a walk after this, maybe do a little exploring before I get on a ferry. So before I do all that, let's answer some questions. I told you I'm wearing the Inclination shawl. Da-da-da-da. Oh, let's start with the exciting stuff so I don't forget, because my mind's a little bit all over the place. Just a couple days ago, I'm like, what day is it? I don't know what day it is. You'll be watching this on Friday. It's Thursday. So just a couple days ago, I released the Oxbow socks, which I have knit 3 pairs of. Here is 2 of them. And you may have gotten a little sneaky peek of these hanging behind me in my studio for the last couple months. I had them on my little knit blockers behind me, and I kept forgetting that they were there when I would go to record. So these are knit up in Spinster's Daughter. Look at that stitch definition. And this is a sport weight. Because I know that there are going to be people who just really want to use sock yarn, maybe they want nylon in it, maybe they just have their favorite sock yarn. I also wrote the pattern for fingering weight. And the fun thing is I actually use the same needle size for both the sport and the fingering weight. So I've knit up 3 pairs. These 2 are in Spinster's Daughter Sport. And then my 3rd pair, which I don't have with me, I knit up in Bear Paw Sock from Farmer's Daughter Fibers, and they are just a great little relaxing knit. I knit almost all these while walking, and this was my first time writing a pattern with a heel flap and gusset for the heel. So if you've knit some of my sock patterns, you know my go-to is definitely the Flegel heel, followed closely by an afterthought heel. But I started reading about the old heel flap, and I know some people, it is like their ride or die. They absolutely love that construction. And when I was reading about it, I started to understand why, because it really can be modified quite well to deal with different arches. So I have really flat feet. I don't have much of an arch at all, but one of my friends has a super tall arch. So we both have the same pair of clogs, and they fit her foot so perfectly because of her high arch, because they are kind of tall on the top with the part that covers the foot, where for me, because of my flatter feet, my feet will kind of slip out of them. And so when we were talking about those shoes, it started to kind of connect the dots for me about like, okay, here are some sock fit things that come up for people. And with a heel flap, which is this bit right here, if you have a really tall arch, so if this area is longer for you than it is for, say, me, you can knit this longer so that you end up with the correct depth for your own foot. So as I was just learning about that construction, I found it really interesting. And I don't think it's that difficult to figure out that modification once you've knit a couple pairs. I think it's pretty intuitive how to do that, because really what'll happen is if you do knit this longer, the only thing you need to know is you then have to pick up more stitches along here to create your gusset and decrease out those extra stitches. And that's really where the main modification would happen. So anyways, it was really fun to explore heel flap construction. So these are knit from the cuff down. They're little ankle socks, because I have just been wanting some little ankle socks. A lot of times I go calf length, but it was really fun to switch up also the length of the ankle there. And yeah, this is one of my favorite stitch patterns. They're called the Oxbow socks because you may recognize that stitch pattern from my Oxbow cardigan, which I designed like, oh my gosh, I don't know, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, 8 years ago. It's a long time ago. And I've used that stitch pattern in all kinds of things. It's also in my big cozy cardi, the hoarfrost shawl, the Gibb sweaters. So I've used it a lot. It's just a knit purl, simple little stitch pattern. And I just love it. I find it really relaxing and I love the outcome. I also like that it kind of mimics a ribbing in how it kind of squeezes a little bit. And I really like that feeling for a sock. So this is just one color. And then for these, I got excited and had leftovers. So I changed up the cast on color. And then I also did a little contrasting toe. So anyways, the exciting thing about these socks is they are the socks for our annual sock knit along challenge. So coming in just a couple weeks, what day do we cast on? I want to say the 28th. I bet I have it in my notes here. I'm going to put it in the notes. I don't trust myself right now. But I'm pretty sure it's around the 28th. We're going to cast on. And then we're going to try and bind off that whole pair of socks by December 2nd at noon Eastern Standard Time. So all of the information for the knit along is in my Ravelry group. And I also just posted a great little infographic on Instagram. So you can find it there too. But I will link the hashtag so you can find things easily. But you can also just go to Drea Renee Knits. That's my Instagram handle. Or I'll have the link to the Ravelry forum below. And we have a really exciting grand prize. Farmer Starter Fiber is giving a whole year subscription to their Sock Squad Club, which is a sock subscription where you get, I believe it's a skein of sock yarn and a contrast color, like every month, I think, for the year, right? I should confirm that, but it's all in there too. So such a good prize. And then there's another prize with some of my patterns in it. So, and finally, the most special part of the knit along is this will be the third year now that Candace and I from the Farmer Starter Fibers have teamed up to support her nonprofit Sisters United. And so every November we've been using the Sock Knit Along Challenge and this pattern release to support that nonprofit. So through the end of the knit along, which is December 2nd, if you buy the Oxbow sock pattern, then 15% of that sale will go straight to Sisters United. And Candace is also donating 15% of sales from the Bear Paw sock yarn, which is the fingering weight one, through November 21st to Sisters United. And you can also just donate on your own if you would like to. All of that is linked with the information. So I'll put another link down below just so it's easy. Sisters United. If you're not familiar with Sisters United and you get my newsletter, go make sure to check your inbox because I wrote all about what prompted Candace to start that nonprofit, what it supports, the things they've been able to accomplish since she started it quite a few years ago now. So they're doing really, really amazing work and it's a great one to support. All right, let's get into some questions. Question number 1. I've knit the DRK Everyday sweater and love to wear it. It fits great and my gauge is almost spot on. However, the collar is too loose and doesn't lay flat around my neck but stands up and is wrinkly. I'm planning to knit another one. What can I do to avoid this too open collar? So, they also went on to say what yarn they've used, which is Ulyssee, and they knit it continental style, which is looser than if they had done English style. So it does just sound like your ribbon gauge is too loose. It sounds like that needs to be tightened up. So lots of ways you can fix that. One, it sounds like you do know how to knit both continental and English, so you might want to swap over to English if you knit tighter that way to help tighten up that ribbing. Another idea is just drop down another needle size or two to bring that ribbon gauge down. Those would be the two easiest things to do. That's all it is your gauge was too big in your ribbing, because it definitely shouldn't. If you're ever seeing like a ripple in your ribbing, that means your ribbing gauge is too big. So that is what I would do. I would tighten up that ribbing gauge. All right, next question. I recently made a lovely lace hat with a couple inches of ribbing. I used a long tail cast on, which is my go-to method. The problem is I feel like there's a tight string around the bottom when I put it on. Everything else is great, and it'll be fine once I block it, but I'm thinking there's gotta be a better cast on. Do you have a favorite method for hats? So I do. I'm gonna write myself a little note here so that I don't forget to link them. My all-time favorite cast on, which I use for almost everything, is the tubular. It is so beautiful and seamless looking to me. I find it to just be really tidy, aesthetically pleasing. It is a little finicky, but it's nice and stretchy. So I adore that cast on and I highly recommend it. I think once you get through the learning curve of it, it's really not bad, but the first time you do it, first couple times, it's probably gonna be a little fiddly. You'll have to watch a tutorial. If you're like, no ma'am, I don't want to make this trickier, I just want a more flexible cast on, but I want it to be as easy as possible, then I would do the twisted German cast on, which I have used in most of my hat patterns. So if I have a hat pattern that doesn't use the tubular cast on, it uses the twisted German. So the twisted German is really similar to a long tail cast on and how you're going to hold your yarn. I have a tutorial for it. I'll link that below. But it really does a great job of giving you a stretchier cast on because of the way that you manipulate your little movement. You're going to use up just a little bit of extra yarn. The other thing I love about it is reversible. So a long tail cast on actually does have a right and a wrong side, which isn't as important if you're joining in the round right out the gate. But it does have a right and a wrong side. It doesn't look the same on both sides. So I like that the twisted German cast on does, especially if you're doing a hat that maybe sometimes you're gonna wear it with brim down, make it slouchier. Maybe sometimes you wanna roll that brim up and you just wanna have that nice cast on both sides. So twisted German is probably the one like I would absolutely recommend. But if you want to take on a little more of a challenge, then I would do the tubular cast on. Also probably going to depend on what kind of ribbing you're going into, if it's 2x2 or 1x1 or 2x3 or whatever. If it's 1x1, tubular is probably how I'm going to go. But the twisted German you can do no matter what ribbing you're going into because it doesn't match up to the ribbing where a tubular cast on does. It makes it look like your knits and pearls start right away with the cast on, which is pretty cool. So I'll link both those for you so you can check them out. All right. I like to knit socks. In fact, I have a handful of them that I love, but they're slippery. I have some health conditions and have to be careful in what I choose to wear, socks and shoes, etc. I was wondering if you have any recommendations on how to make the socks less slippery. I have thought of adding little hot glue dots on my socks, but I'm scared that it will ruin them. I absolutely love your work. Thank you for being an inspiration. Thank you so much for your kind note. So I actually picked this because I would love to know if anyone has some good ideas for this, because if you live like I do in a house that has hardwood floors, especially for my kids, hand knit socks can be so slippery. So I do get a little bit nervous about it. One thing I have seen people do is puffy paint on the bottom. You could do little puffy paint dots or little squiggles. I have not done it myself. I'm actually trying to think right now if I have a specific, because I don't feel like all my socks are equally slippery. I would definitely think that woolier socks would have a little more grip. Super soft, like MCN, merino, cashmere, nylon are probably gonna be way more slippery because they're so soft and silky and smooth. But yeah, I'm so curious because I'm sure there's lots of us who've experienced the wood floor and a hand knit sock. I feel like with wear, they also get better and become less slippery. I feel like when I have a fresh pair of hand knit socks, they're more slippery. And it's obviously not a problem on carpet or even tile, but like a hardwood floor, I've definitely like, whoop. So anyways, I guess this is more of a crowdsourcing one where if anybody else has things that they have found to be helpful, with that, because it is kind of an issue. All right, next question is about gauge. I have questions about gauge that have been lingering in my mind for quite a while now. I have several times experienced my final row gauge growing a lot in the finished garment compared to my swatch. The most extreme example was a garter stitch long cardigan where length and arms grew so much in blocking that I frogged back a whole skein of yarn. I guess this effect is due to the fact that there is quite some weight dragging down the fabric in the garment, which is not the case in the swatch. My question to you is if you have any suggestions how I could get a more accurate gauge swatch from the beginning. I mid-block my projects a lot, but it would be nice to also be able to rely more on my swatch. I always block my swatches. I knit a bit more than a 10 by 10 centimeter swatch, and when blocking my garment, I am very careful not to let any of the fabric hang during the process of blocking, so this wouldn't stretch it out. So yeah, it sounds like you already have some really great practices in place when you swatch. But okay, that cardigan you're talking about though, I'm actually not surprised that you saw even more growth because it's the garter stitch. That is one of the things. So garter stitch is like horizontal ribbing. And what happens is your pearls pop out to the front, your knits sink to the back, and it squishes down the fabric, just like how vertical ribbing is like an accordion and it squeezes in. That is what garter stitch does like this. But once it's been blocked, and especially in a long cardigan that you're then wearing, it's going to stretch out like an accordion over time. So the place where I really experienced this a lot was when I was designing my traveler hoodie. I actually have in there a lot of information in the notes about how much it's going to grow post blocking. And I find that sleeves tend to grow more than the body. And so I put like all those kinds of tips in there because it's surprising how much certain stitch patterns really, really open up. So especially when it's the weight of a whole garment. So I would actually recommend doing a bigger swatch than you're doing. You're doing a bit more than a 10 by 10, but we want to measure that full 10 by 10 centimeter in the middle or 4 by 4. Oh, just losing headphones. Anybody else have that problem? I think I have like the right size. Anyways, so I would recommend doing like at least a 6 by 6 would be close to like a 15 by 15 centimeter. You could even do a 20 by 20, like double it if you're really concerned, even just in your row gauge, because that seems to be the issue. Like, so it doesn't have to be 20 by 20, it could be 10 by 20, but maybe giving it some more length so it's a little more true. Some things that people will do, it sounds like you're doing everything right with blocking it and drying it. Some people will hang their swatch to dry when it's going to be a garment that's going to be hanging and they know gravity is going to play a role in stretching it out more. So that is something you could try. It's going to take some experimentation because for me, I mean, I even know people who weight their swatches down. Like, so they will hang their swatch, they'll like clip it to hang, and then they'll even put like a hanger through the bottom. I personally think that's over manipulating the swatch because you don't know how much, like it's just not like to me, doesn't sound like a very scientific approach of like, you don't know how much weight to add to stretch it. You could be overstretching it now, or then can you really trust that gauge? So I have never really loved the idea of weighing it down, but I can see how hanging it to dry would be helpful because at least you're going to get a little pull on it then. The other thing I would really be careful with, depending on your stitch pattern and growth, a huge thing that I actually find is one of the main culprits is when people are using superwash yarn, especially if the pattern didn't call for superwash yarn. So superwash yarn grows inches in length or centimeters in length more than a non-superwash would, and that is because generally speaking what makes a superwash yarn superwash so that it doesn't felt is that it's been stripped of the scales on the outside of each individual little fiber, and because of that it can no longer grip onto itself to avoid some of that stretching. It's going to be more slippery, it's going to stretch and grow more. So you really want to take that into consideration, is make sure that if you're following a pattern, if that pattern was knit in non-superwash yarn and you're choosing to sub in a superwash, that's fine, but really do consider, oh, this is going to stretch much, much more. So one thing you can do is before you get to, let's say you're knitting a top-down sweater, Sorry, I'm sitting on the floor so I can be near the window to have some light. So you can see this bed behind me. Okay, so if you're knitting a top-down sweater, you could, before you do the hem, pop it onto some waste yarn or a barber's cord or something like that and wet block it and let it dry. And then try it on and see how you like the length, because that is going to show you, you still might get a little bit of growth just as you wear it, but it's going to show you a pretty true idea of what that length is really going to be. So you can decide, okay, does this look good? Do I need to add a little more? Do I need to take a little off before I add my ribbing? You could also just do it right before you bind off. So you could already have your hem in place, but a lot of times people don't want to reknit ribbing is what I have found to be true. So if you don't want to have to reknit ribbing, that's why I'm suggesting to do it before the hem. But you could also just do it right before you bind off, wet block it, try it on, sleeves, everything. And if the length feels good, great. Take out your waste yarn or your barber cord, put your needle back in, bind off, you're done. Or nope, not quite right. I'm going to take a little length back out, or I'm going to add a little bit more. It just would make it a little easier, a little less undoing and redoing by kind of having it done in those stages. There's no reason not to wet block or steam block at the minimum a work in progress to make sure that your gauge is staying true to what your swatch told you. Because it is, I mean, swatches are so helpful and they give us so much information, but they are not going to be 100% accurate to the finished garment because of the fact that they're just not as big and there's not as much gravity playing a role. Also, one of the things that can happen is when we're knitting a swatch, we tend to be kind of focused. We're excited about this new project. We're really like giving it our attention. Maybe we're even a little nervous. We're gonna learn some new techniques. So a lot of times when we're doing a swatch, we might be knitting a little bit tighter, where once we're like really into the middle of a project, we tend to get into a place where we relax a little. So your tension can also change throughout a project. So keeping an eye on your gauge while you knit, that is why I like to do measurements pre-blocking of the swatch and post-blocking of the swatch. So you want your blocked swatch gauge to match what's in the pattern. But if you know what that gauge was before you blocked it, when you're working on, let's say, your sweater, you can check your gauge periodically in that unblocked sweater against the gauge of your unblocked swatch and make sure that those still match. Because that means if they do, then once you do block your sweater, it should be pretty close to your blocked swatch gauge. So hopefully that makes sense. It's kind of a confusing thing to try to articulate, but hopefully that makes sense. Okay. Last question, I think. Yes, question 5. Okay, I knit my husband a sweater every fall, and this year he chose Gib. The sweater looks like fun to knit, but last time I knit him a raglan, he disliked how the increases gave the neckline a squared off effect. I think I can make this better by adding some short rows to create a little crescent of fabric that rounds off the back of the neck. But where should they go? If I add them just before the pattern short rows, it would interrupt the line of the raglan increases at the neckline. Could I add them in the neck ribbing, or would that look odd on the finished product? Okay, so the short rows for Gib are in the ribbing of the collar. Aren't they? I'm like 90% sure. Yeah. So they're already there. And that is not necessary. So what that is going to help with is lifting the back neck. It's not going to help the shape of the front neck. So if in the past what he is feeling he doesn't like is the shape of the neck hole, it's the shaping that creates that. So it is how, can we just take a moment? I just realized, oh my gosh, I'm so matchy. Look at that. Okay. So what's really going to affect how round that is the rate of, depending if you're going top down, bottom up. Gib is top down, so it would be the rate of increases. And generally to shape a neck hole, you're either just going to do increases, and then you're going to cast on the remaining stitches here, What rounds it out more is if you increase, and then cast down a little chunk, a bigger chunk, and then the biggest chunk. I hope this makes sense. And that is what's going to give you like the different slope effects. You can also manipulate it a little bit when you're blocking. You could even put some pins in there to kind of block it out to a nice shape that you like. But yeah, for that, if you wanted to add more short rows in the back neck, you could. And again, I believe I did it in the ribbing and the collar. I really like to put them in the collar depending on the sweater, when I really don't want to disrupt how the stitch pattern looks beneath the collar. So that is a great option for future patterns that don't have short row neck shaping. Then that would be an option. So, all right, we talked about the oxbow socks. We talked about the knit along. We talked about what I'm wearing. So I think that is everything. I hope that y'all have such a good weekend. Hopefully next week I will be doing a little video from my new studio, although I don't know how soon it's going to be set up. We still have to paint, and my studio now is going to be significantly smaller than my old one. We used to live in a like 120-year-old house where I had the whole attic. Now I'm just in a room. And so I'm like, oh, when I was in an attic, apparently I collected more fiber art supplies. So it's going to take a little finagling to get my studio in order. It's going to be kind of interesting. So we'll see. We will see what will be behind me next week. But I do hope to see you back here and have a great weekend. I hope you get some making in. And I guess that's it. Happy knitting. Bye.